We're live.
Hi, good evening, Tamisha. Your mic is muted, so we haven't heard anything you said.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our special seminar presentation this afternoon, or this evening rather, on embracing the social and human rights model of disability as a means of transformation in the post-COVID Caribbean environment. Our presentation this evening is being hosted by the University of the West Indies Center for Disabilities Studies of the Faculty of Social Sciences. The purpose and continued focus of initiatives like the one we're engaging in this evening is focus on building relations for the common good of not just the Caribbean region, but by extension, the larger world. The UWI Center for Disability Studies has as its mission to transform and empower individuals with disabilities throughout the Caribbean through the use of applied research, education and training, and public advocacy. As a sort of a precursor to this afternoon's presentation, I wanted to outline that the discussion is going to be focusing on the strategic alignment, so to speak, if I may go that bold or be that bold, the strategic alignment used or that will be required to achieve the desired outcome with regards to really the promulgation of full inclusion and just creating a space where persons with disabilities are indeed protected and they have just as much rights within the society as any other individual. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted in 2006, the 13th of December, and was fully entered into force on the 3rd of May, 2008. And since that time, countries like Jamaica have taken steps, positive steps, I would say, towards true integration and the protection of rights. But there are, of course, many, many more steps that we need to take. And the pace, I would argue, needs to be quickened. And so in the spirit of never wasting a crisis, so to speak, the current epidemic would have provided opportunities while we try to navigate and create new strategies to eke out a new normal for persons to really now have a discussion within this space as to where do we see and how do we properly meet the target space of having persons with disabilities, their social and human rights protected. And so our panelists and keynote speaker this afternoon, they're going to be delving into the heart of this sort of situational analysis for us, identifying what change is necessary and how we can get there as we move and march forward in the right direction. So we want to thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to a productive 2 hours. We're sure you will enjoy it. We want you to be engaged. You will be able to type in your questions throughout the evening in the chat. And once we get to the question and answer section, we will field the questions at that point. I want you to take this opportunity to invite our members from the Faculty of Social Sciences just to extend additional welcome to everyone who is looking on and participating this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamisha. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Bassiani, lecturer in the Department of Government and Associate Dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences. Good afternoon, everyone. Esteemed guests, students, colleagues, presenters, Senator Morris. Welcome to yet another in our series of FSS at 60 celebrations. We continue to reflect, celebrate, and chart the path forward for the Faculty of Social Sciences. I am pleased that my colleague, Dr. Morris, and his team from the Center of Disability Studies have organized this event as our faculty and our university contemplate the different ways in which we can be more inclusive, more receptive, and more empowering. I look forward to hearing the evening's proceedings, and I'm really interested to hear what our eminent panelists and, of course, our keynote speaker, my friend Dr. Morris, will have to say. Dr. Morris, a personal thank you for hosting this event under the auspices of FSS at 60, as our faculty celebrates 60 of students and faculty members and research and advocacy. Thank you, and all the best for your event.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vassiani. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our panelists as well as our keynote speaker this afternoon. We have with us Dr. Stephen Myers. Dr. Myers is an assistant professor in law, societies and justice, and international studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is core faculty in the University of Washington's Disability Studies program. His research focuses on the interactions between international law, global social movements, and grassroots associations representing marginalized groups in the Global South. His 2019 book, Civilizing Disability Society, traces the ways in which the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has transformed grassroots disability associations on the ground in Nicaragua, oftentimes in ways that clash with Nicaraguan civic culture and ignore the expressed needs of local disabled persons in lieu of international priorities. I must say that's an interesting read, and I think that's something we probably should delve into in another space. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Myers has worked and continues to work with a number of international NGOs and United Nations agencies on issues of disability inclusion. In 2008, he co-authored the UN Population Fund's flagship report on youth with disabilities, young persons with disabilities, global study on ending gender-based violence and realizing sexual and reproductive health and rights. This was launched in 2018 at the UN General Assembly. At the University of Washington, Dr. Myers created courses which focus on global philanthropy, disability in global perspective, and human rights and international development. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Myers was an international projects director for an NGO providing landmine survivor assistance in Central America and Africa, a disability inclusion consultant for the International Labour Organization, and numerous international NGOs in the field of disability and aging. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Myers as one of our panelists. We also have with us Mr. George Abulazulov. I'm very sorry, I think I may have gotten that name incorrectly, is a Palestinian human rights defender with approximately 30 years of experience in the field of international human rights and humanitarian law. He is currently the Senior Human Rights Advisor to the United Nations Resident Coordinator Office and the United Nations Country Team in Jamaica and the Bahamas. In this function, he supports United Nations agencies, funds and programs, as well as the government of Jamaica and civil society in promoting and protecting human rights in Jamaica and the Caribbean. He holds a master's degree in children's rights from the University of Freiburg and Institute of Children's Rights in Sion, Switzerland. Welcome. And additionally, we have Ms. Karian Eiffel. Ms. Eiffel has been working tirelessly for the past several years in broadening the opportunities for equality for persons with disabilities. Having served as the first person with a disability as president of the Senate of Barbados, Ms. Eiffel is the current president of Barbados Council for the Disabled and the Caribbean Council for the Blind. She's current chair of the CARICOM Advisory Panel for persons with disabilities. She continues to serve on several panels and has made presentations to several local, regional, and international fora on a variety of topics. And our keynote speaker this evening is Senator Floyd Morris, who I'm sure is someone who doesn't need any introduction, but allow me to in any event. Senator Morris is a graduate of the St. Mary High School, and he is also the holder of a bachelor's in mass communication, and he has a master's of philosophy from the government, from the University of the West Indies. Senator Morris has worked significantly in terms of the promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities, and these include specifically Workers' Bank. I'm so sorry. He has been the recipient, of several scholarships, including from the Workers' Bank Scholarship for Students with Disability, Circle K International Scholarship, the Postgraduate Scholarship, and the Sir Frank Worrell Scholarships. He is called to national duties in 1998, where he became the first blind person to be appointed to the Senate. He has distinguished himself and was promoted to Minister of State in 2001. He was assigned to the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, where he had special responsibility for the Program of Advancement through Health and Education, otherwise known as the PATH program, the National Insurance Scheme, persons with disabilities, and senior citizens. Senator Morris was reappointed to Parliament in 2012, where he served as a government senator for 4 years. He was promoted to the president of the Jamaican Senate in 2013. Senator Morris is a devout Christian and a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He's married to the vivacious Shelley-Ann, and he's the 2011 Domino champion for his home church, the Andrews Memorial Seventh-day Adventist. His motto is, "It is nice to be nice," which I believe is a motto we can all borrow. So that's our wonderful panel this afternoon. At this time, I'm going to hand over to Senator Morris, who will deliver our keynote address this afternoon. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, members of the erudite panel, members of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and other distinguished members of the University of the West Indies, members of Parliament and of the Senate, members of the community of persons with disabilities, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good afternoon to you all. It is a signal honor for me to participate and give the keynote presentation for this seminar on the topic, Embracing the Social and Human Rights Models of Disability as a Means of Transformation in the Post-COVID Caribbean Environment. The theme is fittingly appropriate and appropriately fitting for times like these, when the world and the Caribbean is going through one of the worst pandemics to affect mankind. The COVID-19 pandemic, at the point of delivering this address, has claimed the lives of over 3 million individuals globally and directly impacted the health of another 150 million individuals. This pandemic has affected in a negative way the lives of the most vulnerable groups in societies, such as children, senior citizens, and the persons with disabilities. For this presentation, I will take the opportunity to look at the situation of persons with disabilities in the Caribbean, in particular, the models of disability that have been shaping the development trajectory, and how can we go about transforming the region in a post-COVID-19 environment to make it more responsive to the needs of persons with disabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the deep underbelly of the social and economic landscape of the Caribbean where persons with disabilities are concerned. It has exposed the considerable deficiencies in the education system, as children with disabilities have not been able to access their education on an equal basis with others. Persons with disabilities have been further isolated from the labor market, resulting in an increase in poverty amongst this population. The social protection systems are woefully inadequate to cater to the needs of persons with disabilities, as highlighted in a recent Caribbean Policy Research Institute study. Furthermore, healthcare and health facilities throughout the region have not been able to prioritize the health of persons with disabilities, as demonstrated in the recent COVID-19 vaccination exercise in Jamaica, where persons with disabilities have not been featured as a priority group, as stipulated in the Center for Disease Control guidelines. All of these deficiencies have come about due to the lack of modern thinking on programs and policies for persons with disabilities. To understand the nature of programs and policies for persons with disabilities in the Caribbean, one has to have a perspicuous understanding of the models of disabilities associated with such programs and policies. Thus, one must understand the primordial models of disability that have been dominating regional and global development. The welfare, medical, social, and human rights models of disability have been the four dominant paradigms driving regional and global development. The welfare model, which dominated the pre-independence era in the Caribbean before 1962, has posited the view that persons with disabilities have very little or nothing to contribute to society, and it is best that they be confined to a home or institution where they are supported by the state or their family. Such antiquated thinking has contributed to the development of programs and policies that are anchored in welfare, hence its name, the welfare model. The Poor Relief Act of Jamaica and other similar legislation in the other Caribbean countries were fashioned of this model of disability. Even the Constitution of Jamaica carries negative nomenclatures relating to persons with disabilities when it refers to persons with disabilities, persons with mental illness as lunatics. The welfare model carries negative languages and references to persons with disabilities such as handicap, lunatics, dumb, cripple. Additionally, the built environment never took consideration for persons with disabilities under this model. Thus, educational institutions, hospitals, public facilities, and other such services were built without any form of accommodation for persons with disabilities. This is why, for example, educational institutions throughout the Caribbean do not have adequate accessible facilities for persons with disabilities. Furthermore, health facilities and workplaces throughout the region are inaccessible to persons with disabilities, thus contributing to these individuals having lower health outcomes and high levels of unemployment. The unemployment rate for persons with disabilities in Jamaica, based on a Ministry of Labor and Social Security 2015 survey, for example, showed just over 90% of persons with disabilities being unemployed. And allied to the welfare model, is that of the medical model. The medical model posits that it is the disease affecting the individual that is the cause of the problem and nothing else. Thus, under this model, emphasis is placed on curing the disease affecting the person. This model fails to recognize diverse contextual factors such as the built environment and the negative attitudes and myths towards persons with disabilities, which, according to Mike Oliver, impact on the ability of the person with the impairment to function efficaciously in society on an equal basis with others. The entire health architecture of the Caribbean has been developed on the medical model. Resultantly, healthcare and health facilities within the Caribbean are inaccessible to persons with disabilities, and health professionals have not been trained in how to relate to persons with disabilities. For example, persons with disabilities have complained about how they are treated when they try to access sexual and reproductive health services from health facilities in the Caribbean. Some individuals are of the view that persons with disabilities ought not to be involved in sexual activities, and as such, refuse to offer the requisite sexual and reproductive health support to these individuals. Additionally, there is the absence of appropriate communication strategies to relate to persons who are deaf, blind, or individuals with intellectual disabilities. These failures have contributed to the ongoing marginalization of persons with disabilities in the Caribbean. The failures of the welfare and medical model contributed to persons with disabilities across the world embarking on an intense lobbying in the 1970s into the 1980s for radical changes in how persons with disabilities are perceived and treated. In distinct societies, persons with disabilities wanted to become active participants in their societies and to be included in their development agenda. The intense lobby resulted in the formation of the social model of disability. The social model of disability postulates that it is various barriers of society that serve to restrict the participation and inclusion of persons with impairments, thus hindering their ability to participate on an equal basis with others. The preeminent thought in this model is that if the varied barriers that are created by society, such as social, economic, environmental, and attitudinal, are removed, then the participation and inclusion of persons with disabilities would be increased. The social model of disability serves to inspire the formation of the plethora of organizations for and of persons with disabilities in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s in the Caribbean. The multiple accomplishments for and of persons with disabilities within the region are largely due to the Herculean efforts of the organizations catering to persons with disabilities in that era. These organizations are under significant financial pressure, largely due to the classification of the region as an upper middle income country by the World Bank in 2008. Thus, the region has seen grant funding being shifted to poorer countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. Organizations for and of persons with disabilities in the Caribbean have been experiencing significant financial stress as a consequence of this consequential taxonomy. Some of these organizations have been relying on governmental organizations for funding, which strengthens the independence and capacity to effectively lobby for persons with disabilities. The social model has aided an incremental shift towards an inclusive education system for persons with disabilities since the 1980s. There has been a burgeoning of persons with disabilities in mainstream educational institutions across the region. These individuals have done extremely well at institutions such as the University of the West Indies, and this is largely attributed to the progressive policy environment for students with disabilities. For years, Caribbean countries have engaged in special education as the normal means of educating persons with disabilities. In this means of education, persons with disabilities are exclusively educated in a segregated environment. Whilst this means of education at its time and place, it never and has never contributed to the maximization of the full potential of persons with disabilities. Special education is therefore seen as an antiquated means of educating persons with disabilities, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities requires that as far as possible, states parties must move away from this mode of education to one of an inclusive education philosophy. The social model of disability, which forms a preeminent part of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, has set the stage for the global transformation of attitudes towards persons with disabilities. And while some progress has been made, considerable work needs to be done to radically transform the societies for the inclusion and participation of members of this community. It is within this context that the human rights model was developed. The human rights model of disability affirms the view that persons with disabilities are human beings and is entitled to all the fundamental rights and freedoms espoused in the various global human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Contextually, all these rights have been reaffirmed in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted by the United Nations in 2006. All the countries within the Caribbean have signed and ratified the CRPD. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties provides the jurisprudential authority for international treaties, such as the CRPD. It defines a treaty in Article 2.1a as an international agreement concluded between states and written form that governs international law. The International Court of Justice has been established as the supreme international judicial body to adjudicate disputes with varied international treaties. Article 38A of the statute posits the court, whose function is to decide in accordance with international law, disputes that are submitted to it shall apply, among other sources, international convention, for instance, treaties, whether general or particular, establishing rules expressly recognized by the contesting states. The CRPD is therefore binding and justiciable global treaty, and countries within the Caribbean that have signed and ratified this treaty have a duty to implement its provision. Policymakers, technocrats, and advocates of persons with disabilities in the Caribbean must understand the diverse models of disabilities. It is these models of disabilities that have shaped and influenced the programs and policies directed at persons with disabilities within the region. The world is now in the era of the social and human rights models of disabilities. These stress the rights of persons with disabilities to be included and participate in society on an equal basis with others. Therefore, programs and policies should be fashioned to allow for the full participation and inclusion and non-discrimination of persons with disabilities. I have taken the time and opportunity to outline the diverse models of disability that have shaped and fashioned programs and policies for persons with disabilities in a post-COVID-19 environment. Fundamental change will have to take place in order to ensure that persons with disabilities are brought in the mainstream of Caribbean society. What are these changes that are needed? For the social and human rights models of disabilities to be accepted and entrenched in Caribbean societies, legislative action is imperative. Thus far, 6 countries in the Caribbean have disability-specific legislation. All the countries within the region must ensure that legislation is in place to protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. This is why the UWI Center for Disability Studies, in collaboration with the Office for the CARICOM Special Rapporteur on Disability, will be hosting a special conference in July 2021 to get all countries in the region to establish a disability-specific legislation to protect persons with disabilities. Governments within the region have to move with alacrity to establish an inclusive education system for persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities must be educated in the mainstream education institutions. This means that government will have to make schools accessible for students with disabilities. Teachers have to be trained in how to relate with students with disabilities. Modern technologies for persons with disabilities have to be made available to schools, and support staff have to be placed in schools to assist students with disabilities. Education is a right, not a fashion. With data showing over 90% of persons with disabilities in the region unemployed, there is an urgent need for governments within the region to implement mechanisms to stimulate employment for persons with disabilities. There is need for a quota system that works in the public service, tax incentive for private sector companies, special grant funds for small business development for persons with disabilities, and special procurement mechanism in the public sector for business owned and operated by persons with disabilities. All of these ideas will stimulate significant jobs for persons with disabilities in the Caribbean. Healthcare and health facilities across the region must become more accessible and inclusive of persons with disabilities. For this to happen, professionals have to be trained and to be able to relate to persons with disabilities. Health facilities must become accessible. More medication must be provided to these individuals, and systems must be put in place to facilitate ease of registration. Additionally, governments must ensure that boards governing facilities include persons with disabilities. The social protection system within the region must be reformed to accommodate the rights-based environment that we are operating in. In this regard, persons with disabilities must be given the opportunity to work and contribute to a pension mechanism. Similarly, social protection schemes should be linked to some form of development objective in order to improve the quality of life of persons with disabilities. Support structures must be put in place for parents of children with disabilities so that they can offset some of the expenses that they have to incur for their children with disabilities. Persons with disabilities in the Caribbean and their families must understand the power of the index finger. There is an estimated 750,000 persons with disabilities in the Anglophone Caribbean. And when conflated with their family members, they morph into a potentially mighty army. Persons with disabilities must therefore organize more strategically and use their right to vote to lobby for their inclusion and participation in Caribbean societies. No inclusion, no vote. Finally, governments within the region, working in collaboration with community of persons with disabilities, must engage in a massive and consistent public education program to transform the negative attitudes and stigma towards persons with disabilities. Change cannot take place overnight. However, if there is a deliberate, strategic, and focus-driven public education strategy, attitudes will change over time. We cannot afford for the rest of the world to be moving ahead of us, and we are languishing behind. We must therefore embrace the social and rights-based approach to disability in the post-COVID-19 environment. It is time for action. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Hello, are you able to hear me now? Hello, good evening.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, perfect. At this time, we would like to ask Ms. Eiffel to commence her presentation. Thank you very much, Senator Morris. That was wonderful. I've learned a lot. And I am looking forward to the other presentations to come. We could just move on to Ms. Eiffel at this time.
Good evening, Dr. Floyd Morris, Director of the Center for Disability Studies, Mona University of the West Indies, and my very dear friend, other distinguished members of the government of Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, my distinguished panelists, colleagues, friends, supporters, all persons, good evening and welcome to another opportunity for persons with disabilities to raise their voices and discuss the challenges and issues that touch each and every one of our lives, irregardless of disability, irregardless of country of origin. I bring you greetings from the beautiful island of Barbados. This evening, I have been asked to address the topic of the mainstreaming for persons with disabilities in everyday society. Against this backdrop, I've decided to take a paper produced by ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, back in 2018. And in this paper, they outlined 5 key areas in which we still need to do improvements. I decided to take each of these 5 and explain why these areas still need to be addressed in terms of our mainstreaming, or in many instances, lack of mainstreaming for persons with disabilities in the Caribbean region. In the Caribbean, as Senator Morris has very ably established, we have ratified several treaties for persons with disabilities. Several countries have enacted legislation, and others have drafted clear policy guidelines on what they want to see for persons with disabilities. This presentation this evening, ladies and gentlemen, seeks to outline whether these goals are being achieved. The first recommendation coming out of ECLAC was the need for the development of national legislation frameworks, which is critical to the protection and promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities established in international human rights treaties. Even though all 13 Caribbean countries have now ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, to date, only 4 countries, 6 now I believe, have national legislation on disability. What does that mean in terms of our mainstreaming? It means that continually across the Caribbean region, persons with disabilities are largely underrepresented and underconsidered in the legal frameworks, even in those territories where legislation has been established. As recent as yesterday, a discussion was engaged by the population of persons with disabilities from the Caribbean region, which indicates that we are still marginalized due to the lack of implementation on the part of our governments. In countries where the legislation has been established, persons with disabilities are still on the margins of society in terms of employment, recognizing that 80% of persons with disabilities who are unemployed live in third world developing countries. As much as Senator Morris has indicated that in 2008, the Caribbean region, our territories have largely graduated to upper middle income status in terms of our positioning within the World Bank. Our persons with disabilities have not, for the large part, experienced the trickle-down effect. Is this where we have been 10 years ago? No, it is not. You are seeing more persons with disabilities attaining university level degrees, attaining vocational training. Several governments have these programs in place. However, on a legislative platform, the rights and needs and responsibilities of persons with disabilities are largely underrepresented. Take a look at the social security measures put in place across the region for persons with disabilities. Using Barbados as a template, our legislation indicates that persons who are blind or, and please forgive the archaic language, deaf mute, are entitled to the non-contributory pension. There are benefits, of course, in terms of disablement and invalidity. I will not bore you with the details and the differences, but for the large part, suffice it to say that most persons who are not blind or deaf or mute survive on welfare benefits. And those, as we all know, are given on a needs assessment basis. So several persons with disabilities remain without the financial wherewithal to sustain themselves and any families with which they reside. Our legislation continues. In many cases, the language is still very dehumanizing and demoralizing to the population of persons with disabilities. Therefore, in this regard, mainstreaming needs to be broadened in terms of legislation. I pause for a minute to let those facts sink in. The second area, disability statistics needed to be improved in the sub-region. At present, it is difficult to analyze the situation of persons with disabilities across countries because the statistics on disability are generally not comparable. Member states need to work together to develop more harmonized, and I pause on that word, more harmonized census questions to facilitate analysis of disability. In 2010, most Caribbean countries undertook their national census between 2009 and 2011. Most countries at that time, and I would like to believe even more of them now, have implemented what is commonly known as the Washington Group of Questions into their census data. This means that there are roughly 6 categories of questions related to persons with disabilities. And for these, we are extremely happy. I must pause here again to recognize the work of the Caribbean Council for the Blind, which back in the 1980s and early 90s worked assiduously for all countries to have at least 2 to 3 questions representing statistical analysis for persons with disabilities. Sadly, however, in spite of these strides, these national statistics on disability is not broken down in a way that can give us the critical data we need to understand the situation as it relates to persons with disabilities. They largely do not account for persons with disabilities with multiple impairments. Too often, they do not give a true representation of the financial status, the healthcare needs, the physical access, the limitations to access to information. Therefore, governments need to broaden the involvement of persons with disabilities by implementing a more disability-focused approach to collecting statistical data. Until our countries know who live with disabilities and what their general experiences and specific realities are, we cannot adequately provide for persons with disabilities, and therefore we will continue to remain on the margins of society. The third area where greater effort is needed is to adapt the physical and social environment to enable persons with disabilities to participate fully and equally in all areas of society. This applies to public buildings, public spaces, transport services, places of work, hospitals, schools, shops, cinemas, and many other spaces. Many countries have established varying degrees of accessibility legislation. In Barbados, for example, we have the National Building Code, which is still awaiting full implementation, however. There are standards at the Caribbean level to which countries are encouraged to subscribe, but none of them, to my knowledge, and I will speak under advisement on this, are enacted across the board. As we become a more digitally conscious society, access to information in the digital Caribbean is still part of, and I do hate to use this cliche term, but it speaks to our reality, the digital divide. Too many persons with disabilities have little to no access to the information available to others in ready formats. Persons who are blind and visually impaired are largely excluded from accessing newspapers on an equal basis with others, which is what equality and inclusion and mainstreaming strives to achieve. Too often, persons with disabilities are considered as second. They implement other things first and then consider, how do we include? Policies need to start with the concept of universal design, which means that from the outset, when places are being constructed, renovated, retrofitted, whatever terms are being used, persons with disabilities and their needs should be considered to be more meaningfully included. The fourth area of concern is education, which plays a key role in empowering and transforming the lives of persons with disabilities. You'll notice that I did not speak of the issues related to transportation just now. When I spoke about physical need, I identified it as one of the areas where we need to improve access. I did that specifically. Limited transportation does not only impact significantly on the lives of working persons with disabilities, and persons with disabilities needing to participate in leisure activities, in recreational sports, in healthy lifestyles, but it has a very significant and debilitating impact on the inclusion of children and students with disabilities in mainstream education. If a child or a student with a disability resides in far-flung parts of our countries, more often than not, they have limited to no access to accessible transportation to bring them forward. Are things improving in this area? Most definitely. As recent as last year, the Barbados government, through the Barbados Transport Board, purchased a number of electric buses, which all make provisions for at least one person with a wheelchair to ride on the bus as part of any other member society. This is an effort to be lauded, and I'm sure that many other countries can put up their hand and say we have similar, but it is still inadequate for children with disabilities, especially in those areas of highest concentration in terms of education. But transportation is only one area of concern. This region has been violated like the rest of the world due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of our children are still experiencing education in an online environment. And many schools with children with disabilities, many institutions that provide for the education of persons with disabilities are still on the margins, are still awaiting inclusion in the online environment. All persons with disabilities cannot be, like other people, cannot be included in education online. But enough has not been done as a region to ensure that students with disabilities can meaningfully and realistically access information in the educational program. That means that for the last year, most students with disabilities are behind their peer groups, even further than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. The fifth area is renewed efforts must be done by regional institutions, governments, and civil society organizations, which is needed to strengthen regional collaboration of persons with disabilities. What this is saying that as a region, our governments and our institutions need to make sure that the projects we implement speak to persons with disabilities in a more realistic and meaningfully inclusive manner. Now, you might say that all of what I've said just now paints a very bleak picture. But I am the kind of person that I love to show the stick, and then I like to show the carrot. The reality is this: things are far better and much more improved than they were before. We are seeing large components of pockets of institutions where persons with disabilities are being spoken about, are being included. We are seeing more opportunities for persons with disabilities to access a larger proportion of government services, private sector employment, and other areas. It is not what we need it to be, but it is far better than it used to be. We have opportunities in sports, political life. We have opportunities in employment. As the pandemic continues to ravage the economic landscape of our region, we also recognize that persons with disabilities can become a better, more meaningful part of employment. All of us have been working remotely at one stage or the other for the last year. That means that more persons with disabilities can be employed in a larger way. Let us take the opportunities that are in front of us now to rebuild a society that is stronger and that is more inclusive, and where we can say next year that the mainstreaming for persons with disabilities is even better than it was in 2021. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eiffel. At this time, I'd like to invite Mr. Abul Zolof to make his presentation. And again, apologies for the mispronunciation of the last name.
It's okay. Good evening, everybody. Let me first share my screen. I hope. Where's my PowerPoint? Sorry, 1 second. Where is it? No. I hope now you can see my screen. Yes. Okay, good evening, everybody. And it's really a great honor to be with you all tonight. And I would like to thank the University of West Indies, the Center for Disability Studies, as well as Dr. Morris and Faculty of Social Sciences, and convey gratitudes and greetings from the UN Resident Coordinator of Jamaica, Dr. Gary Cornell, and congratulating the faculty for its 60th anniversary. And actually, this is also an opportunity to renew our commitment as United Nations to continue our support to the government, civil society, academia, legislative bodies, judicial authorities in the country, national institutions, for the full realization and recognition of the rights of all citizens, especially rights of persons with disabilities, to ensure their protection, respect, and full realization. It's a great honor to be with you tonight to talk about how we can ensure in the broader Caribbean society a greater respect for human rights of persons with disabilities. I was asked to focus on two main issues, and first on the international human rights law level and its domestic implementation, and secondly within the context of COVID-19 or during and post COVID-19. How can the broader society assist in greater respect? What is the level of respect in the country? We want all of you, my speakers before me, highlighted several challenges and issues on the full implementation of the CRPD. But why we think that there is a need for greater respect and greater implementation of the rights of persons with disabilities? Because first, is for the first time we have an instrument that recognizes the universal human rights standards that are applicable to all, especially those persons with disabilities. It's also for the first time it defines clearly what are the key obligations of states to promote, protect, and the fulfillment of human rights of persons with disabilities. And finally, the convention itself, it sets a national and international monitoring on its implementation and to ensure its full realization at the national domestic level. What attracted me actually personally about this instrument, and I am so proud to say also that Dr. Morris was one of those behind the adoption of this important international human rights instrument, and he was recently elected as a member of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, not just representing Jamaica, but actually representing the whole Caribbean. The whole motto of this document, when it was adopted, or this convention, was nothing about us without us. It's all about participation. Nothing about the rights of persons with disabilities without giving them the opportunity to participate, to develop a document for them, by them, and with them. This is the greatest achievement, I think, which created this great and major shift on the realization on the rights of persons with disabilities globally, this human rights instrument. So it was very inspiring beginning actually with the participation, high level of participation of organizations of persons with disabilities, civil society, in the whole process, especially the drafting process, which was for many global experts that it was unprecedented in the whole UN history when they were used to negotiate international instruments. So persons with disabilities themselves, over 800 representatives of specialized organizations, mainstream NGOs, national human rights institutions, they were all get together in one movement, one voice, a strong motto: nothing about us without us. Our voice should be heard. These are our rights that are recognized under international law that should be an integral part of this instrument, which is its key purpose is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. So when we talk about who does it protect, this important human rights instrument, we are talking about those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And here I want you to consider that the diversity of impairments, physical, intellectual, psychosocial, sensory, etc. To think about women with disabilities, children, older persons, etc., and other elements. So it is a comprehensive in terms of its definition, okay? And when we talk about its key and main principles, it's very clear also from the speech of Dr. Morris that inclusion, participation, accessibility, these are, when we talk about core principles, means these are the backbone of this international human rights instrument. Non-discrimination, respect for difference and diversity, equality of opportunities, respect for the inherent dignity, etc. These are the guiding principles of this convention. Actually,
the world keeps moving.
I wanna show you this short video, which is just 2 minutes. It's about participation and nothing about us without us. Then I will continue. Sorry.
The world keeps moving without us. People with disabilities are often left without essential services, out of schools, work, public spaces, and public life, because authorities and policymakers often shape our communities without asking what works for us, assuming they know what's best for everybody. But that is not true. As persons with disabilities, we understand better our problems and how to solve them. That's why we must participate when public decisions are made. How? Consulting and engaging with organizations of persons with disabilities. These organizations play a key role to translate opinions and concerns into public policies. They represent our voices in decision-making processes, and they are a vehicle to demand changes. But governments often consult others who don't experience disability, but who call themselves experts on us. And we, the real experts, are ignored. Sometimes, the places or the way consultations are conducted are not accessible, making the process meaningless. And sometimes, governments consult only a few individuals, so the diversity of the community is not represented in the decisions. Public money around the world is still used in projects that leave us out of public services, culture, and every other aspect of the community life. Let's stop this waste. We can change this to ensure that all public investments include people with disabilities. Governments must support organizations, making it easier to register them, promoting their work and independence, and providing the funds they need to build their capacity. And their participation in all public decisions must be guaranteed by law. Permanent councils for dialogue and engagement with our organizations must be established. Every consultation must be accessible to all, and individual accommodations must be made for those who might need them. We know what works for us and can contribute to find better and innovative solutions for all. Decisions should always be made by all people concerned. That is why we say, nothing about us without us. The world.
Okay, thank you so much. I think the message is clear, nothing about us without us. The responsibilities, I want to here to try to highlight some important facts. And Dr. Morris talked about the number of countries ratified, and actually we have unprecedented ratification of the convention in the Caribbean region. And we have 6 countries already have legislations related to the rights of persons with disabilities. And when I say enforcing the rule of international law, we know all that when any country ratifies any international instrument like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it has to be domesticized. We know that it is a dualist legal system in the Caribbean mainly. A dualist systems means that they have to transfer the provisions of this international instrument in their own domestic legal system. They have to draft legislation. And I'm so happy that in July, what was declared by Dr. Morse, that there will be a regional conference on enforcing legislative measures in the Caribbean around this issue. And we were engaged in different discussions with the center at the UE to discuss possible cooperation in this regard, because we all know that the first beginning in the realization of the rights of persons with disabilities is the legal basis, the legal protection, the legislative framework. Without having a solid, coherent legislation that provides the legal protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, it will be very difficult to talk about other issues. So it's very important to strengthen the legislative structure in the Caribbean. And it's very clear there are responsibilities under the convention that first and foremost, the duty bearer is the state. And when we talk about state, it's the legislative power, it is the judiciary power, and it's also the executive powers. We have the responsibilities of the private sector, the health sectors, the education, the social, and everyone in the society has a responsibility in this regard. And in summary, what has to be done, the list is very long, but mainly we need start, as I said, laws and policies in place. We need funding, resources, how much money and resources allocated in this regard, services that are accessible to all, awareness raising on their rights, training of professionals, undertake research and data collection. Some of you mentioned about the lack of statistics. There are serious lack of data around the rights of persons with disabilities and their numbers and statistics. We need in-depth, comprehensive monitoring, including by independent human rights institutions. We need to strengthen the ministerial, the justice, judiciary, building the capacity of state institutions, and finally, the persons with disabilities themselves so that they can claim their rights. These are all has to be done, and they are all taken from clear provisions from the convention itself. So if we want to talk briefly now about the COVID-19 situation in the Caribbean, and this, even though it's also happened in many countries globally. What do we mean by a human rights-based approach with the post-COVID-19? Actually, because we are still in the COVID-19 environment, my focus will be within and post-COVID-19. Despite being a population that's particularly at risk to COVID-19, persons with disability, they are usually face greater inequalities in accessing health care. During the pandemic, due to inaccessible health information, environments, as well as selective medical guidelines and protocols that may magnify the discrimination persons with disabilities may face in the healthcare system. And we know all the protocols, but these protocols are sometimes reveal some kinds of medical bias against persons with disabilities concerning their quality of life and social value. What can be done by the states in the Caribbean in this regard? We want to ensure continued supply and access of medicines for persons with disabilities during and after the pandemic. We need training and awareness raising for the health workers to prevent any kind of discrimination and exclusion or bias against persons with disabilities. We need closely to consult and actively involve persons with disabilities as I said earlier, nothing about us without us. Have they been consulted, asked, or not, and why, etc. We need to prohibit the denial of treatment of the basis of disabilities and repeal provisions that prevent access to treatment based on the disability. The priority of testing of persons with disabilities have been given the testing and also the vaccinations. We need to promote further research actually on its impact and implications on persons with disability. We need to remove and identify first and then to remove all the barriers to their treatment. Hospitals, testing, quarantine facilities, etc. All should be, all kinds of barriers should be removed. In other, like persons with disabilities living in institutions are institutionalized, they even face heightened risk of contracting COVID-19 due to underlying health conditions. Difficulty in enforcing social distancing, for example, among the residents and the staff of these institutions. Sometimes we have cases that they were abandoned by staff, these persons with disabilities in these institutions. So they face greater risk of human rights violations. What can be done as recommendations to ensure that these practices are not there? We need to discharge and release them from institutions if there are any such a kind of risk, and of course provide alternatives. Prioritize testing and promote preventive measures within the institutions and reduce infection risks by addressing overcrowding and hygiene, etc., etc. What about those living in the community, persons with disabilities living in the wider communities? Also, they face specific barriers in carrying out their daily lives in their own communities. Okay, in particular, when they stay at home restrictions that like the curfews and all of this, have we considered their needs or not? What can be done when there are disruptions and new risk on their autonomy and health and lives, etc. Here, what we recommend that the state has a responsibility and all the duty bearers to ensure that there is support for persons with disabilities and they are exempted from stay-at-home restrictions as much as we can. Was there in these protocols and the gazettes announcement, they were considering that these restrictions are not applicable to persons with disabilities? We need to ask about this. We need also, like when we establish like the opening hours, okay, what have been put in place to ensure that they are given the priorities when they go to groceries, to supermarkets, shopping, etc. Of these issues. So then when it comes to the work, their income, livelihood, etc., they are less likely than others usually to be employed, and when even they are employed, they are more likely to be employed by the informal sector, and as a consequence they have less access to social insurance based on their employment than others, which decreases their economic resilience in the current COVID-19 context. Those who are employed or self-employed even, they might be prevented also from working from home, like what we do nowadays. So if not by their employer, sometimes there's absence of equipment, and here some of you were focusing on this regard, including, I'll come now to the education. So there are so many equipments and facilities that needs to be supported and available that are in the workplace, but they also can be available for them in their homes to be able to work from home. So what we recommend, we need more financial assistance for persons with disabilities that without any income, like lump sum payments, tax relief measures, subsidization of goods, etc. We need to increase the existing disability benefits, including through advancing payments to cover other extra costs that they are facing. We need to implement more financial assistance programs, food provision schemes, etc., etc. On the education front, which I heard strong emphasis by colleagues around it, and in most states, we know that the educational institutions were either temporarily closed or until now, like what we face here in Jamaica, most of the educational institutions are still closed. And we are adopting the remote learning practices. And in these cases, the students with disabilities are facing also serious barriers on account of the absence of required equipment, access to internet, accessibility to materials, etc. We need to ensure that they have the required support and they are not left behind and missing their educational right. What is recommended? There is a need to provide further guidance, training, and support to teachers on inclusive education through remote learning. We need to establish close coordination with parents and caregivers for early education of children with disabilities. We need to provide guidance and distance support for parents and caregivers to assist in setting up equipment and to support the education program of their children with disabilities. We need to develop accessible and adapted materials, develop accessible educational audiovisual materials in specific. Now, related to protection from violence, we also know within the context of the Caribbean, where we have very high levels of community violence, sexual and gender-based violence. So the vulnerability is there. And the persons with disabilities are at higher risk of violence, particularly when they are isolated. Women and girls with disabilities also face higher rates of gender, sexual, intimate partner, and domestic violence. What needs to be done? We need to ensure that reporting mechanisms in space, hotlines, emergency shelters when needed, and other forms of assistance are accessible to include persons with disabilities. We need monitoring and to carry out, especially by civil society and organizations working on rights of persons with disabilities, on the monitoring of the situation of the persons with disabilities, especially those who are living in isolation, by engaging in proactive outreach, including through community and voluntary networks. We need to raise awareness and provide the training on the risks of violence faced by persons with disabilities, especially women and girls with disabilities. And finally, on prisoners. We know all of you have heard what happened. There were cases also, prisoners with disabilities who died in detention. So they are overrepresented among the prison population, and especially those who have psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities. They are at heightened risk of infection to the high risk in the crowded and unhygienic conditions. Physical distances is not possible. So many prisoners with disabilities depend on their informal support of their peers to access food, move around the bath, and prison health services are generally inadequate to meet their needs. So there are so many issues here needs to be considered by states, especially by reducing the prison population and releasing at-risk groups of prisoners, including persons with disabilities. Actually, they should be given the priority in this regard and apply early release and probation, or shortening or commuting sentences and reducing the use of pretrial detention. Secondly, implement preventive measures within the prisons to reduce the infection risks. That's it from my side. I apologize for maybe taking extra time, but I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. But I think there are lots of things need to be done, and with all your efforts, I'm sure we can make a big difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was very informative. At this time, we're going to hand over to Dr. Myers.
Okay, let me just share my screen as well. Let's see here. Okay. Here we go. All right, I would like to thank Senator Morris and the Faculty of Social Sciences and everyone at the University of West Indies for inviting me to speak on this panel tonight. But I'd also like to thank the participants. It looks like we have about 100 people participating in this special seminar. And, you know, given the time of day that it's happening and how fatigued we all are, I think having 100 people participate is a real hopeful sign about how importantly people in the Caribbean take these issues and how committed people are to learning about inclusion and pushing forward with the rights of persons with disabilities. So I really want to thank and applaud and congratulate the organizers of this seminar, but also, you know, to applaud all the participants. So I was asked tonight to speak on the question of what are the next steps, what next steps need to be taken by Caribbean countries to accelerate the pace of development for persons with disabilities. And I think I'm going to answer in a surprising way. And the way I'm going to answer is by saying that I don't know what those next steps are or what they should be. But I do think I know who does, right? And that's civil society organizations representing persons with disabilities. So I'm going to be building off a little bit of what Mr. Abulzoloff was just speaking about, the importance of participation. And this question, what are the next steps? It's not for academics like myself or policymakers or even, you know, so-called experts. That's always been one of the barriers that persons with disabilities have faced, is that others are speaking for them rather than they speaking for themselves through their civil society organizations. The reason why I'm making this argument or making these statements is because of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities itself. If we go to the CRPD, right, we will see that it is an important and innovative piece of international human rights law. And its innovation is not in that it protects the rights of a particular group of people. We've had the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We've had conventions on the rights of women and girls or racial and ethnic minorities. We've done that before, right? And now we include persons with disabilities. And the CRPD is not innovative in terms of the rights that it enumerates, right? The right to education, the right to employment, the right to health. Those have been articulated going back to the Declaration on the Rights of, on the Declaration on Human Rights. They've been around. What is innovative are two particular articles that I want to focus on. First, if we go to the general obligations, it states that in the development and implementation of legislation and policies to implement the present convention, states parties shall closely consult and actively involve persons with disabilities through their representative organizations. And then if we go to Article 33, it states further, civil society, in particular persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, shall participate fully in monitoring this the implementation of the convention. This is an enormous change in international law. No other human rights convention empowers the beneficiaries of those rights to participate so closely in defining what those rights are and monitoring their implementation. This is what makes the CRPD different, and it's what makes it more powerful than prior international human rights conventions, those conventions that came before it. And this will be the reason why we study the CRPD in the future, to learn what does it mean to bring civil society so closely into the implementation of the convention, right? And what does it mean to make it an obligation of states to seek their advice and their consultation? And it's no accident that civil society has this role. As Mr. Abuzolov was talking about the inspiring beginnings to the convention, the CRPD, right? It was all centered around that motto of the disability movement, that motto of nothing about us without us. Other people will not talk about what our needs are. We will talk about what our needs are and how we want them to be met, right? And so the inclusion of civil society is also in keeping with the Agenda for Sustainable Development that was adopted in 2015. The motto of the SDGs is leave no one behind. The reason for this motto is that past development policies have failed to include the very people who needed to be included the most, those that were most marginalized, especially persons with disabilities. And as we all know, people with disabilities know how best they can be included more so than any expert or anyone else, because they have the lived experience and have been dealing with the barriers to inclusion all of their lives. While I've said I'm the wrong person to answer this question, I do want to make a few contributions, and those contributions pertain to what is needed for a strong and vital civil society in the Caribbean. Because right now we have a tremendously dedicated civil society representing persons with disabilities, but it needs to be stronger to fulfill its role and truly speak for persons with disabilities in each of the members' countries within the regions, right? And when we think about COVID and the impact this pandemic has had, I believe it has had an incredible impact on civil society, because civil society is based on the ability of people coming together, talking with one another and understanding their issues, and then representing, taking those out to other people. And the fact that we're socially distanced, we haven't been able to meet face to face, we have to do it through digital technologies, which are not accessible to all, especially those in rural areas and those that are in poverty. Civil society really needs a focus. It really needs attention right now to be built back up, to have the vitality it needs to do its job, right? And so the first thing that I want to talk about, and this is in terms of where in a world of scarce resources and so many needs that we're going to have post-COVID, where the priority should be. What should be the first thing that's done for ensuring the rights of persons with disabilities and their inclusion and development. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the need for adequate public funding. States have a positive obligation to consult civil society. I believe a corollary with that is they have an obligation to support civil society, just as you would support a consultant that you hire or an advisor that you seek advice from. They, need to be paid for this. They can't do this for free. And I saw earlier that we had Miss Gloria Goff on the call, on the seminar tonight. And I'm sure that anyone who has spent any time with Miss Goff knows she has too much to do. She is spread a little too thin. And that's because she, as the president of the Combined Disabilities Association, is constantly being asked to review laws and policies and speak for persons with disabilities. And that requires a lot of time, but it requires research and support. And so organizations like the Combined Disabilities Associations really need to be adequately funded, right? And the Jamaican government is doing the right thing in seeking her advice, but it needs to realize that she and all other DPOs need support in order to help the government fulfill its obligations to the convention, its obligation to seek the advice of civil society. And I believe that funding not only needs to be adequate, but it needs to be guaranteed, meaning that it is written into policy, written into law, so that from year to year it does not change, but it's known and it's guaranteed. And it can also be removed from politics. There's a, you know, when we're asking civil society organizations to monitor the implementation of the convention, that will oftentimes mean criticism, critique. And so the funding needs to be made insulated from politics. It needs to be a guarantee that organizations can count on from year to year, irrespective of what they say, whether they say a government is doing a good job or a bad job, right? So the second challenge I want to talk about is not a challenge for government, but a challenge for civil society itself. And it's a challenge about inclusivity. As we all know, almost all the civil society organizations throughout the Caribbean and around the world are located in major cities, and their most active members are from those cities. But we also know that the most marginalized members of the disability community are often those living in rural areas where they are cut off from organizations, may not even be aware that they're out there. Secondly, I believe that there is an unevenness in the strength of different associations representing persons with disabilities. Jamaica, which I know best, the associations representing the blind and the associations representing the deaf are extremely strong in comparison to associations representing other disability groups. There's a need to build up those organizations representing persons with psychiatric disabilities, intellectual disabilities, mobility disabilities, and so forth, to ensure that their voices can be fully represented as well. And lastly, I want to talk about older persons. One of the great successes of the Caribbean is a lengthening lifespan. The Caribbean is one of the fastest aging populations in the world. And that's due to people having more access to health and greater development. This is a success that countries like Jamaica have more 70 and 80 and 90-year-olds than they've seen any time in the past. And with that means a real change in the population of persons with disabilities, because now more than ever, there are people that have not had disabilities throughout their lives, but they're aging into it as they get older. And they may not identify as a person with disabilities or identify with disability rights or even be knowledgeable. So I want to challenge civil society in the Caribbean to reach out to older persons and bring them into their organizations, older persons that have aged into disability and acquired it later in life. Those are the people that need to be invited because they're an important voice that needs to be represented. And so that's where I think I'm going to leave things, because I know we need to have time for questions and answers. But again, I want to thank the University of West Indies for inviting me. And I really want to thank the vital job that civil society organizations have been doing. And I'm interested in your feedback in terms of these challenges that you face and in terms of public funding, but also in terms of inclusion. Okay, thank you. Let me.
Thank you very much. That again, I think we've gotten a good and a wide spectrum in terms of just the fulsomeness of the discussion this afternoon. At this time, we want to open it up for any questions that persons may have. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I'm not sure if I'm missing it. Well, we have a comment here from Miss Dacia Leslie, which says, excellent presentations, agreed 100%, Miss Leslie. And Christopher Chinapu has, is really more making a comment or extending an invitation on behalf of the Technical Committee for Correctional Services. We wanted just remember, you can type your messages in the chat. Okay, so we have a question here from Shelley and Gail Morris. And the question is, what can be done to change the classification of the Caribbean as an upper middle-income country to make the disability organizations access more grant funding? It's a very interesting question.
Oh.
I'm not sure which of our panel members would like to take that question.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator.
I guess I would want to take an attempt at that.
Yes.
Because I noticed as well that Steve had pointed out and expressed his concern about the extent of funding for organizations with and for persons with disabilities in the region, because it's a real challenge that is impacting on every single non-governmental organization within the region. And what happens is that it forces these organizations to have to depend on funding support from government, and it causes these organizations to lose their independence when they have to depend on government funding. So what I think needs to happen is that irrespective of the classification that the World Bank has in place for the region as an upper middle income country, they should make provisions for organizations catering to persons with disabilities to be able to access the funding sort mechanisms, irrespective of the fact that they are within upper middle income country, because whilst the region is an upper middle income country, it is also a heavily indebted region. So there is not a lot of funds available to be made available to disability organizations. And so, you know, and this is where, you know, I am going to be, doing whatsoever I can to be a part of that lobby. I see my good friend George is with us here as a part of the UN family as well. And I guess Steve, from his standpoint and his connections in the United States, can also put in his voice to say, look, whilst the region here is an upper middle income countries, the fact that you have shifted grant funding from the region to poorer countries is squeezing organizations with disabilities. So efforts must be placed and emphasis must be placed on non-governmental organizations catering to vulnerable groups such as persons with disabilities. And this should be a general principle that is adopted by these multilateral organizations.
Thank you. Senator Morris, I want to send this question your direction as well because it is specific to Jamaica. The question is from Monica Bartley and it says, what is the present status of the National Disability Act in Jamaica? That's one part. And the second part is, how do we mobilize personnel from the health sector to visit communities of people with disabilities to inform them about issues such as COVID-19?
Oh boy, you know, Monica, my darling, my love, I've not seen you for a long while, and I'm so very happy to know that you are participating in this space. And, you know, greetings to you wherever you are. I see some persons from the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities on the Zoom in the seminar, and you know, ideally I would, at this point in time, I try to avoid answering the questions about the Disabilities Act and its implementation, since you know we have been languishing for some 7 years since its passage. But the last time that I heard was officially the Governor General has announced that it is going to be implemented this year. And I am aware that the codes of practice for education, for employment, for healthcare have been formulated. And well, the building code, which is a part of the Building Act, is already in place. And I understand from the team at the Ministry of Labor and Social Security that they are waiting on the drafting, the completion of the regulations for the Act. And the Minister will set the effective date sometime in the not too distant future, but I can't give any specific date for it. I have gone on record of telling the minister to set the effective date and make everybody work towards the date, because that is the only thing that is preventing the legislation from being implemented. And I can only go as far as saying that Monica, where the legislation is concerned. Now, I mean, the issue of mobilizing health workers to get them in communities for sensitizing persons with disabilities about the COVID pandemic and other issues is very important, because for me, and this is a part of the challenge that we have not I would have thought that we would have had more persons with disabilities registered in the database at the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities. At the moment, it's just about 30,000 individuals in that database, and the population is far greater than that. And one of the reasons why it is important for us to have a database with addresses and that sort of contact detail of persons with disabilities is because you can effectively plan and strategize when you have that sort of data available, and to dispatch persons out in the field to say John Brown is at 1A Floyd Morris Avenue, and they would be able to go and visit that person with disability there. But that has not happened. And so we are left groping in the dark with our policy. What has been happening, from what I understand, is in the COVID environment here, they have had to ask councillors and members of parliament to assist in getting out some of these vulnerable individuals, senior citizens, and some persons with disabilities. And so some persons with disabilities have been vaccinated. But in an organized and efficient society where you put persons with disabilities on your priority listing, you would need to start from accurate data. And Kerry Ann, in her presentation, point to the need for accurate and correct data. And that is something that we're gonna have to work on in the post-Caribbean environment to make sure that we have accurate and consistent data to assist in the mobilization and sensitization program. And then a natural corollary to that is we will have to train these health professionals in how to relate with persons with disabilities, because it is one thing to have the skill set to deal with healthcare issues, but it is another in terms of relating to persons with disabilities. And definitely we want to make sure that all of these individuals are trained in how to relate with persons with disabilities. And that is why, you know, at the Center for Disability Studies, we are rolling out a number of initiatives to engage in training of public officials. And one exciting initiative that we're coming up with within another year, we are going to be introducing a minor in disability studies at the university in the Faculty of Social Sciences, because again, the Faculty of Social Sciences is leading and driving the whole process in terms of the disability agenda at the university. And, you know, there are other faculties doing things as well, but, you know, we want to make sure that we step up the training mechanism for persons with, for professionals to relate best with persons with disabilities. So that is what I hope I've been able to respond adequately to your question, Monica, but that is the situation as it is now.
Thank you, Senator Morris. We have a question. I'm throwing it out to all the members of the panel. Question is from Christopher Chinapu on the issue of accessibility standards. How can we accelerate and scale actions that takes standards off the paper and put them into practice? And part two of the question, how can we leverage partnerships to improve accessibility for persons with disability everywhere?
I will take that one. And I will say part 2 is really the answer to part 1, because it is not enough for us to say that we need to improve accessibility, but we need to leverage the various partnerships that we have, and where we don't have partnerships, we seek them out to help others to understand and recognize the importance of inclusion of persons with disabilities. We're part of the community like anybody else. We have the right to participate, and we have the opportunity, and we need to be given the opportunity to participate. And the only way that can be achieved is when we start looking at strategic partnerships. The Disabilities Right Fund is an organization out of the US that does third world funding. And one of the things that I found extremely encouraging with their setup, their board of directors largely encompassed persons with disabilities, which is what you want to see in DPOs. However, one aspect that I think a lot more of our organizations needed to do is this part of their structure. They had what they called bridge builders, and they went into other sectors and segments of the community. And so they had someone representing the Fortune 500 companies. They had someone from another one of the diversity groups. And I can't remember what the third category was on that particular occasion when I checked. But what they did is they went out and purposefully sought persons that came from a different background of disabilities to bring other conversations to the table. When those people came and sat down to the table, they brought their perspectives, but they took away a lot more than they brought to the table. And so through that bridge building, they were able to leverage a lot of things to get more of a foothold, so to speak, in areas where we couldn't. Now, as it relates to accessibility, those are the kinds of alliances and allegiances. In Barbados, for example, we have the Barbados Institute of Architecture, and I'm sure that across the region, there are similar entities. Seek opportunities to integrate with persons like those. There are other fora. There's the Caribbean, there's a Caribbean News Network. That is another forum that we need to bring into our spectrum. There is SEDIMA when it comes to disaster risk management, disaster mitigation. Those are partnerships that we need to leverage. Look at all the aspects of life. See what regional and local entities are working in those areas, and find persons within there that you can bring into your orbit. And not only bring into your orbit, but also that we can go. We also need to remind persons that we are out here in society. If the only time they hear the voice of a person with a disability is on issues related to disability, they're not going to listen, because they're going to make up their mind that they already know what we're going to say. But when they're out there discussing women's rights, we are women too. Let us speak out on the issues related to women, not just women with disabilities, but women in general. We're parents. Speak about the issues related to children, not just children with disabilities, but children in general. And in that way, bring it home to us. So we let them see that, yes, we have a larger concern, but while we're looking at the larger concern, these are some of the strategic areas of concern that we need you to address as well. So that is how we can leverage those partnerships. Now, if we leverage those partnerships, if we start seeking them and strategically choosing them, that is how the regional accessibility standards can then be translated into action and brought from the paper as was put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. May I add something about this, and maybe a general comment on other questions? Actually, when we talk about rights of persons with disabilities, like any human being, we have two kinds of rights: civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. Civil and political rights, usually they don't need that much budget allocations, like when we talk about right to vote, or like to be registered at birth, etc. Doesn't have that much budget implication. But when we talk about economic social rights, like right to health, education, social protection, employment, etc. These rights require budget allocations, resource allocations. That's why there was a strong emphasis under the convention to monitor also what kind of budget allocations each state allocate to the implementation of the convention. So the questions about accessibility is asking about how to move it from paper, as I understand, or from theory to practice. How can we move what we write on paper about human rights of persons with disabilities to have these realized in their daily lives, especially around issue of accessibility. I think here is very important to monitor, lobby, and advocate for more allocations for their employment, social protection, accessibility at all levels, including access to quality education, especially those who need special care and support to ensure they have education equally with every member of the society. Secondly, I think and also strongly encourage engagement with the private sector, because when I listed the obligation, it's not just the state. You as academia has a duty, private sector has a duty and obligation. Civil society organizations also have responsibilities. So all the community has responsibilities. I agree with issues that on the classification of the Caribbean as upper middle income countries. This has implications on the donors' allocations for the Caribbean countries. But I fully agree with what was mentioned by Dr. Morris, but we shouldn't give up here. We should continue, and there are lots of other funding channels and opportunities that we should think how we can utilize. And as I said, you have very strong committed private sector in Jamaica and the Caribbean. And I am very proud to say we have utilized several opportunities to find funding from the private sector. And I know from Dr. Morris, like Digicel is one of the donors to the upcoming conference in July. So we have strong opportunities. Let us see how we can utilize it together to ensure that persons with disabilities have better access to their rights. Finally, on the statistics, yeah, I think this is important. And we should always emphasize there are not enough statistics and data. Those who are registered are not the actual number, and without data about the scope and how many those and this data should be disaggregated by age, sex, and gender, etc. Very important for us to prioritize and better plan and strategize on addressing all their needs and rights in our own societies. Thank you very much.
Mr. Abuzoloff, I would like to send pardon? I would like to send this question your direction as well. It's from Geisha Burchell. Since all models are undergirded by the human and social rights under the UN Convention, when governments are lagging in implementation, how can persons in the disability community get redress for violations that they're still facing after so many years of the document having been ratified?
Very good and very important question. Thank you very much for Gozia, sorry if I didn't spell it correctly, for the very important, excellent question on how to claim your rights. We know that in Jamaica, for example, and all us actually, unfortunately, all the Caribbean countries who ratified the convention, first, they didn't ratify the optional protocol on the individual complaints. So at the international level, you cannot submit any complaint to claim your rights. But at the same time, the convention asked every country or every state to establish a system in place to ensure access to justice so that you can claim your rights through different ways, through an individual complaint procedures. And still there's much things to be done, and establish the major one of them, establishing an independent national human rights institution. And this institution should provide you with the ability to claim your rights and submit a complaint where you can request a compensation or redress, etc. Unfortunately, we are still far from this, but I think we are on the right track. For example, just last month, I attended the session for the Universal Periodic Review of Jamaica, and Her Excellency Kamina Johnson-Smith, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, emphasized that Jamaica in the process of establishing a national human rights institution. I know in the Bahamas also they accepted the recommendation to establish a national human rights institution, where this will be one of the platforms where you can submit individual complaints and access your rights. But always, of course, you have the right to access the justice system and to have legal aid free of charge, where you can have assistance to claim your rights.
Thank you.
Just to say, you know, because this is one of the issues that is treated on the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And George has aptly indicated that because Jamaica has not signed the optional protocol, individuals cannot make and take their inquiry directly to the committee. And so they have to go through the independent human rights mechanism that have been established in the country. And the committee, before examining or looking at those issues, would want to see and know that the established protocols are followed in the respective jurisdiction before they are able to look or comment on those matters. So it is very important for Jamaica, in light of the fact that it has not yet signed the optional protocol, to one, do so in the interest of persons with disabilities, and two, on the other hand, to establish the Human Rights Institute that would assist in the complaints mechanism, and also the independent monitoring mechanism that the CRPD requires to be established must be established as well. You know, so there's a number of work that needs to be done, and this has to be done post-haste because the country was the first to sign and ratify the convention in 2007, which is basically 14 years ago. And the world is looking at us in terms of what we have done since that time.
Thank you. Dr. Myers, this question is for you. How can civil society organizations face the pressures from politicians when they're criticized?
Well, I think, you know, that goes back to our earlier discussion about having outside adequate funding, right? Because the power of those criticisms from politicians is oftentimes tied to the power of governments to provide them funding and things like that, right? And so guaranteeing the independence, I think, is how that is dealt with. When you're a civil society that has your own funding sources, you're able to be resilient in that way.
Thank you.
Again, Madam Chair, I want to just make a quick comment on that, because I pointed out in my presentation the need for us in the Caribbean to use the power of the index finger. As a population of persons with disabilities, we are one of the largest minority groups in the world and in the region. And when we are joined by our family members, it is a mighty army that we have, and we have to use that to our advantage. So we have to start to organize lobbying for issues based on our strength and our vote. And we have to make sure that we take this matter very seriously and consistently, because politics is a numbers game and politicians pay attention to numbers. So if they know that we have a strong community that is vibrant and that we are going to be moving and working together, then they will not take any chances with us.
Thank you. I have a question here from Sarah Newland Martin. Outlines that unemployment is a vexed issue among persons with disability, and it is even more difficult at this time. What are the plans to try and organize training for persons with disabilities, especially for those who need to be rehabilitated and readjust to the new lifestyle? Senator Morris, I believe this question might be best taken by you.
Yeah, Sarah, my darling, I'm very sorry that this is Zoom, because I would give you a big hug. So I'm sending you a big hug via Zoom, and glad to see that you are back and up and about. Prayers really work wonders, my darling. So sending a lot of love to you from me and Shellyan. I tell you, Sarah, the issue of unemployment, as you say, is a vexing one. When you look at the population of persons with disabilities in Jamaica and the broader Caribbean, it's significant. A large portion of the population are unemployed and living on state welfare assistance. And that is not what we want in the 21st century. We want persons with disabilities to be participating actively in the labor market and working for their own speed. And we see a number of youngsters graduating from universities, from colleges, and can't get any job because the labor market isn't absorbing them, and it is very difficult for these individuals to go through the rigors of tertiary education. And then when they graduate, they are faced with the challenge of getting a job. And what is happening now is that you find a lot of persons are getting frustrated in terms of taking up any training opportunities, because they are saying that, boy, look, boy, you train and you don't get any job at the end of the training. But I say to them, to persons with disabilities, notwithstanding what is taking place out there in the job market, continue to push for training, continue to push for education, because when the opportunity comes, it is those who have some form of certification and training that's going to be getting at the front of the queue. And we have to just keep on pushing, and we have to keep on knocking at the doors of institutions and asking the different state agencies to collaborate with the training institutions so that when they train, for example, individuals at Abilities Foundation, you know, those individuals can get either internship or get employment at those institutions, you know. So those are some of the things that we have to keep on pushing and pressing for.
Ms. Eiffel, as the president of the Barbados Council for the Disabled and the Caribbean Council for the Blind, I perhaps would like to throw the exact same question to you, and perhaps you could give us a perspective from the side of Barbados in terms of the training and the opportunities that are being examined now to rehabilitate and readjust as we get comfortable with our new lifestyle and new normal.
I hope you can still hear me. My headphones died. In Barbados, the government has set out a lot of initiatives recently. For example, we have like online training programs where the disabled community is being approached as well to be included in training. So for example, I just recently completed a course to be a certified career advisor, and they are making those opportunities. There's a program, the National Training Initiative is a program being run through the government as well. And that is largely an online program. They've provided sign language interpreting as one of the programs, coding, I can't remember all of them. I think there are about 4 or 5 courses thus far that are up on their page. And they're offering different programs like that. And they are purposefully seeking out persons with disabilities to participate. For many years, we've had the Technical and Vocational Training Council. They too have put on programs targeting the community of persons with disabilities, and there are other entities. I work with the National Disabilities Unit here in Barbados in the capacity as a consultant, running training in computer and assistive technology for the blind and visually impaired. So there is that in terms of the mainstreaming in that spectrum. However, there still needs to be done a lot more needs to be done in terms of rehabilitation, because while COVID has ravaged our communities, persons are still becoming disabled, people are still losing their vision, becoming amputees, and still need rehabilitative training. So those programs have largely gone on hold, and we need to revamp them so that they are more, I don't want to say COVID friendly, but are taken into consideration the various restrictions and protocols that we're now being exposed to.
Faculty.
Okay, thank you so much. The last question for the night is from Ms. Goff. And the question is, how can the DPO for persons with disabilities encourage a greater participation from the youth?
I can volunteer an answer. Where I've seen youth with disabilities most participatory in civil society is when they have their own organizations. Because as we all know, kind of the issues that young people are facing with, transition out of school, out of education into the job market, dealing with issues around sexuality and so forth. It's really about having their own safe space to discuss those issues and to put together projects that really address them. So I think supporting youth with disabilities organizations is one way to do that. And as they get older, then they will hopefully mature into other organizations, other DPOs. And Jamaica has some successful examples of that, such as DEFCAN, which is a very strong organization of young people with disabilities.
I think, Stephen, a part of that is that we have to start doing some mentorship and making sure that we and succession planning by integrating some young people on the different boards for the disabled people's organization. So, for example, and we're beginning to see that because I know that at CDA, they have a number of young persons that are there on the board. The Jamaica Society for the Blind have a very young board with youthful persons with disabilities there. But they have to infuse both the youth and the seniors to make sure that there is the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and understanding, so that our young people can realize the struggles that we have gone through over the years. Because I remember in the early 90s when I first became a member of the advisory board for persons with disabilities. You had people like Monica Bartley and Wilbert Williams who were actively involved with the board, and I have learned a lot from those individuals along the journey, and I think that the younger generation would do the same by learning from individuals like Gloria. She might have cost me off now to say that, but label her as old, but she looks very, very young, but she is a mature individual, I would say. But she has a lot to pass on to the younger generation, and it's a similar thing that I'm trying to do at the University of the West Indies by getting some of those young people to come in the research space, so that in another 10 or so years when I leave the scene, they will be there to take on and carry on the work, because the work must continue and the work must move on at a different level.
May I be permitted to comment, Chair?
Hello. Yes, go ahead.
Yes. My name is Clyde Phillip. I'm speaking from Port Spain, and I am quite interested in our colleague from Barbados, I think, who says that she has just completed a certified career advisor program, and I want to congratulate her on that. And it's quite interesting because it's just about 2 hours ago, I was actually chairing a global webinar as it relates to differently abled persons in the Caribbean and South America, what we call CASA, that's C-A-S-A, the Caribbean and South America. And I sit as a visiting professor to the African Scientific Institute with responsibility for introducing a set of new careers in this area, careers like drone technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, artificial reality, telemedicine, etc., etc. And we want to specifically get these new careers as far as the differently abled persons are concerned, because we have recognized and realized the major contribution that they can play as far as this new environment in which we now will be forced to live and work. And this new environment, because as we know, the year 2021 is the first year of the third decade of the 21st century. And how things were done prior to 2020, it has absolutely no place now in post-2020. So I am very eager and anxious to, in whatever way we can contribute to the discussions, and not only the discussions, but the actual action items, I will be very, very pleased to be, well, my team will be very pleased to be part of that. My question now is the issue of registration and licensing of our professionals, in particular, if I can speak for the technicians, the technologists in the region, is very important to us. And it is becoming more and more necessary that important seminars such as this be what we call CPD certified or CPD approved. Of course, CPD means continuing professional development. And my question is that, is this particular webinar CPD approved? If so, you know, I would be very happy to understand how I can go about receiving my PDUs, that's professional development units. If not, however, may I kindly suggest that it is be CPD approved so that the participants can receive their particular units, because as I explained, this now is the new requirements. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much for your intervention there. And just to indicate that, you know, no, it is not treated as continuing professional development endeavor, but it is a matter that we can look into for future series. This is not just the first one that we are going to be doing. We are doing a number of them throughout the year, and we can have a further discussion. You can send me an email. Send me an email at morrisfloyd@gmail.com. That's morrisfloyd@gmail.com. MORRISFLOYD@gmail.com. And we can continue the conversation from there. Thank you.
Is it in place that I ask for your WhatsApp number, please?
My WhatsApp number is 876-322-0301.
I thank you.
All right, you're welcome.
On that note, I want to thank our esteemed panelists. I'd like to thank Senator Morris for putting this together. I would especially, I think, like to extend a really big thank you to all of our participants. As Dr. Myers pointed out earlier, as much as we can coordinate, if persons do not participate and get involved, the planning is really just more in theory, and we don't get a chance to really put it into practice. I would like to end on a note that we often start things on, which is with prayer. And that is because there was a huge oversight on my part earlier. And so, Ms. Goff, I hope I'm not going to be laying hands upon you suddenly. But as we close off the session and having heard the wonderful presentations and the collaborative spirit within which we have engaged tonight, I think ending on a note of prayer would be quite fitting. And so I'd like to invite you to just say a word of prayer before we sign off for the night.
Good evening, all. Let's pray and thank the Lord for having us here this afternoon, this evening, in such a wonderful event. May we pray. Heavenly Father, may thy blessing rest upon our people now. Lord, as we come before you this evening, we are confident that you were in our presence. We are confident that you guided us in our thoughts and in the presentations that were delivered. Lord, we prepared our minds to learn from this event and to share our own experiences. And Lord, you provided the listening ears, the people who would learn from it. And as we go forth from this event, Lord, we want you to let us use the information that we have garnered to the benefit of those we serve. Lord, you made us and created us human. So we have human rights, and we must understand our humanity. And Lord, let us use our knowledge, skills, and wisdom to demonstrate that we are no less. Let us use it to empower our people. And Lord, let us recognize the part we must play in our families, in our communities, and in our homes, and in our country, and so that we can be recognized as another citizen, not by our disabilities. Lord, we thank you for this evening. Lord, we thank you for the presenters. Lord, we thank you for the organizers, and we thank you for the participants and the moderator. Thank you, Lord, and we ask your blessings as we go forward in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Ms. Goff. And thanks again to everybody for participating. I had forgotten to thank FSS when I was thanking everybody earlier. Big thank you to the faculty. And we look forward to many more presentations along this line.
Alert, 20 seconds left of meeting.
Right. Have a good night, all.
Thank you, Tamisha.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all. Thank you very much, George. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks very much, Tamisha. Thanks, Gloria.
You.
Thanks to the
Thank you so
technical
much.
team. You know, really appreciate it. Really, really appreciate it. All right.
All right. Always with pleasure. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Blessings.
Good night, everyone. Wonderful presentation. Appreciate it.
As always, a pleasure and a privilege to be a part of anything you organize, Senator Sir. Fantastic.
All right, my friend. All right. Thanks very much. You did very well. You all did excellently.
Oh, is George and Stephen still here? I'd like and you too, Floyd. I'd like a copy of everybody's written presentations.
I'll ask them for it.
Please do.